This lecture is going to be all about adding image building into your Compose files so that it automatically ensures that you have an image ready to go when you run Compose commands. And like other lectures in this section, you really need to have a good sense of Docker container and Docker image command line functionality. So another thing that Compose can do for you is build your images at runtime. It'll actually look in the cache for images, and if it has build options in it, it will build that image when you use the up command. And it won't build the image every single time. It'll only build it if it doesn't find it. You'll need to either use the Docker Compose build to rebuild your images if you change them, or you can use Docker Compose up -- build. We'll actually see that in a minute. This is really great for when you're using Compose locally and you have images you want to build. Maybe you don't want to use volume mounts. You actually want to like copy files in or something into the image. And your build command might be fairly complex. It might have some custom environment variables or build arguments. By the way, build arguments we haven't talked about, but that's really just environment variables that are available only during builds. And you can look at the docs.docker.com documentation on Docker files, and it'll talk about build arguments in depth. But here, we're going to look at an example of how you might use that locally. So I'm in the Compose sample3 directory, and you can see here I have a pre-built Docker Compose file here. I have actually a Docker file called nginx.docker file, and then a similar nginx config to what we had earlier, where we're actually using nginx as a reverse proxy for our website. So if we go into the Docker Compose, you can see how I've architected this solution. I've actually got two services. One is the nginx proxy like before, and one is the Apache web server like before, but a couple things are different. So instead of me specifying the default image for nginx, I'm actually building a custom one. You can see here that I've actually given it some arguments where I'm telling it that the Docker file it needs to use is a specially named Docker file. I want it to build that Docker file in this current directory that it's in. And I want it to name that image when it builds it nginx-custom. And it's going to store that in my local cache. And then down here at the bottom, we actually have a web server running Apache. And what I've done here is I've actually mounted some HTML source files that I have into the Apache server. So the scenario here is maybe I'm a web developer. I have a static website here underneath this HTML directory that I don't really need to worry about too much. It's just using a little bootstrap template. I'm going to be editing on that locally in my editor here, but I know when I go to production with this, it's actually going to be sitting behind an nginx proxy. So I want to emulate that production environment as much as possible locally just to make sure that I've weeded out any bugs or any problems. In this case, I want this nginx, and I know that this nginx config is the one they're going to use on the production server, so then I'm just going to use that here. This is actually the same nginx config as before. So when I run the Docker Compose up command, it's going to first check for the name of this image in my cache. And if it doesn't find it, then it's going to use these build commands here to look up the Docker file and then build my image. And you can see from this Docker file, it's pretty simple actually. It's just going to use a specific version of nginx, and then it's just going to copy a file in. So it's going to get the rest of its information from that nginx config from Docker Hub, and then it's going to copy in my nginx config. And if you remember in a previous example, we actually did a bind mount to get this nginx config in through our Compose file. But in this case, we're just wanting it to build the whole image. We don't really need to be changing this proxy config, so I don't really need to mount it so that I can change it all the time. I just want it to run, right? So I'm going to build it, let it sit in the image cache. Once it's built the first time, it won't need to be really rebuilt very often. So I'm just going to leave there. And then when I'm editing and developing on my website, I'm going to have this configuration so I can do live edits. If we go back over here and I do a Docker Compose up, now let's step through what happened. So it first created the network. That's a normal thing. It does that. And then it actually is seeing that the proxy service doesn't have the image it's looking for. So it's going to build that. So it's pulling out the Docker file and building it just like it would do a normal Docker build command. And then it's giving me this helpful tip to let me know that it built the image this time because it couldn't find it. But in the future, if I need to change that image, I'm going to need to use the Docker Compose build or the Docker Compose up -- build commands. So now that it's got the image, it can actually create the containers, and then it's starting my web server and my proxy server. So if everything worked correctly, I should be able to go to localhost, and it pulled up my default template here, which is a Bootstrap template actually. And it looks like everything works. I go over here and I can see all my logs coming up, and obviously there's lots of assets. So there's a log entry for each one, and it's going to go through the proxy and through the web server. And because I bind mounted that directory for editing, I can actually go back into my editor. And as a web developer, I could go in and maybe, edit something on the website. Maybe I'll go into start Bootstrap title, which should be this little title up top here. And I'll just save that file. And then if I refresh, yeah, my website's updated because of that bind mount again. So this is a great example of a very common developer setup where you need to build some custom images locally. You also need to mount some files into your application so that you can edit them at runtime. And of course, if this needed to be a database-backed application, I would just add a third service down here for the database server. And then I'll go back and do my cleanup. And you'll notice that by default, it won't actually delete that image. And you'll notice up the top here, we have the Nginx custom that it built. But there is a docker compose down command. If you look at the help, you see that there's an RMI option that actually removes images it may have built or it may be using. So there's this actual option here that says, remove only images that don't have a custom tag set by the image field. One thing I could do here, if I wanted to make this a little more automated, is I could just take out that image command right there. Let's just remove that. And then I'm going to clean up real quick. I'm just going to remove my image, docker image rm custom. As you can see, it's gone there. All right, so I'm going to do docker compose up again. And this time we'll do a -d. Now you'll notice throughout these examples of compose that it actually names containers, volumes, and networks with the name of the directory as the project name. That's actually something in compose where to prevent name conflicts, it will actually always add the directory name on the beginning of all of the assets so that they don't conflict with other ones. You can actually change that proxy name through the command line if you go check out the compose documentation. But the point I wanted to make here is if I do a docker images ls here, you'll see that it actually named my image for me. So I don't technically have to use that image option, but if I wanted a specific name for it so that I could maybe identify it later, then I could. The reason I was bringing that up is this is actually a little bit cleaner because what I can do then is docker compose down, and remember in the help it said I could use an RMI type. So when I clean it up, and I like to keep my Docker environment clean, so I can do an RMI local, and what that will do is actually delete those images as well. You'll see down here at the bottom that it deleted the image. So not something that I do all the time, but maybe if I have a big project with lots of custom images and I don't want to bloat up my system when I'm not developing on that project, I'll use the RMI local, and it'll always keep track of the custom images it had to create. And of course here, if I use the all, then it will actually delete every image that was used in this project, which you may not want to do because in this case, it might delete the HTTPD Apache web server, and you might want that image to stay around for a while. So, okay. You learned a lot about Compose in this section, and we're going to be using Compose throughout the rest of this course. We'll keep building on these skills as we go.